Welcome to this Intelligence Briefing Explainer. Right now, we're looking at a geopolitical reality that is literally shifting beneath our feet. The conflict with Iran, it's entered in an incredibly dangerous phase. We're at a point where limited strikes and precision air power just aren't achieving their strategic goals anymore. We've moved way past those initial exchanges and are staring down the realities of what intelligence analysts call Stage 4 escalation. Make no mistake, this isn't just another regional conflict anymore. It's a profound systemic transformation of the entire global order. Okay, let's dive right into this because it highlights the fundamental paradox of modern warfare. We constantly see headlines about these highly successful tactical strikes. Buildings leveled, air defenses wiped out, key leaders eliminated. And yeah, in purely military terms, those look like unquestionable victories. But here's the real question. Why do these successful bombing campaigns so often completely fail to force a political collapse? Why does tactical success on the battlefield frequently lead to long-term strategic failure? So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll unpack the smart bomb trap. Then we'll walk through the 4 stages of war momentum. After that, we'll get into what a systems war actually looks like, followed by the global economic supply shocks, and finally, we'll look at stage 4, which is that massive geopolitical transformation of our world order. Starting off with section 1, the smart bomb trap, or the illusion of precision. We really need to reframe how we view these initial military strikes. They aren't the clean, surgical victories they appear to be. Actually, they're a predictable and incredibly dangerous strategic trap. There is a massive gap between the destruction we can see on camera and actual strategic neutralization. When you watch an air campaign unfold, the tactical successes are right there in your face. Collapsed command centers, destroyed missile sites. But the strategic failures? Those are hidden underground. As military strategists point out, bombing a nuclear facility might vaporize the industrial buildings above ground, but the actual enriched uranium is deeply buried under all that rubble. It's totally intact. It's kind of like panning for gold. You can destroy the pan, you can literally blow up the river. But if you don't actually extract the gold, the underlying threat remains completely unchanged. And then there's the human element, how the targeted nation actually reacts politically. Military planners often assume that heavily bombing a country will cause a fractured society to finally rise up and overthrow its government. But history shows us the exact opposite. Foreign attacks inject this intense, surging nationalism into a population. Suddenly, for a nation of 92 million people, the regime becomes the ultimate defender of the homeland. And if a leader is eliminated in a decapitation strike, well, that triggers what analysts call the harder successor problem. The new leader comes into power in the middle of a war, meaning they face immense, undeniable pressure to prove their strength by escalating the conflict, definitely not by backing down. Moving on to section 2, the 4 escalation stages and the momentum of war. The reality is, wars rarely unfold the way planners draw them up on a whiteboard. Once the shooting starts, the conflict takes on a life of its own, often completely escaping the control of the leaders who launched it. Global analysts outline 4 distinct stages on this escalation ladder. Stage 1 is that initial exchange of tactical strikes and retaliation. Stage 2 sees a broadening of targets, like hitting crucial infrastructure. Think Iran's Karg Island oil hub. Stage 3 introduces intense global economic pressure and brings ground force options onto the table. And Stage 4? That's the parabolic war pressure. It's a point of no return where the conflict triggers a permanent geopolitical shift. And right now, we are approaching this incredibly critical branch between a devastating ground war and that permanent irreversible shift. Just look at the stark military reality as we push into stages 3 and 4. This is absolutely crucial. We're looking at a severe depletion of highly expensive Western defense stockpiles. Systems like Patriot and THAAD interceptors are being rapidly exhausted by swarms of incredibly cheap Iranian drones. To counter that asymmetry, you start seeing the potential introduction of advanced assets like the B-21 Raider stealth bomber or the massive deployment of 6,000 to 15,000 Marines for a ground operation. And here's the most ominous part. As heavy troop losses mount in any potential ground war, the risk of tactical nuclear weapon use suddenly enters the strategic conversation. Which brings us to section 3, horizontal escalation and what we call systems war. We have to stop thinking about this as a traditional battlefield with front lines. Iran knows for a fact it cannot win a direct symmetrical war against overwhelming Western air power. So what do? They use a strategy called horizontal escalation. Instead of fighting directly on the main battlefield where they'd lose, they geographically widen the conflict to impose massive costs on weaker coalition members and the global systems we all rely on. There's a brilliant historical parallel here to the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Vietnam. The US ran massive, technologically superior bombing campaigns that whittled down supply lines, sure, but they absolutely couldn't stop the underlying momentum or the highly decentralized resilience of that network. In a systems war, the targets aren't just military bases. They are the literal arteries of the regional economy. We're seeing strikes on the Bapco oil refinery in Bahrain, reciprocal targeting of Iran's Karg Island, which handles 90% of their oil exports, by the way, and major disruptions at international transit hubs like Dubai's airport. But perhaps the single most alarming vulnerability here is the extremely fragile Gulf desalination and power grid network. Taking out massive power-generating turbines doesn't just turn off the lights. It immediately halts life-saving dialysis, shuts down food refrigeration, and cuts off the potable water supply. We're talking about the very real threat of turning incredibly wealthy, heavily populated regions into completely uninhabitable zones. Let's look at the fallout in Section 4, Global Economic Supply Shocks and the True Price of Conflict. This regional system vulnerability immediately triggers our next massive reality check. A localized military escalation is now directly tied to global macroeconomic survival. I want you to focus heavily on this number right here, 20%. Roughly 1/5 of the entire world's seaborne oil and liquefied natural gas passes through a single highly vulnerable choke point, the Strait of Hormuz. By selectively targeting and controlling this one narrow waterway, a regional power basically gains the leverage to hold the entire global economy hostage. To put that into perspective, look at how rapidly an economic shock like this evolves. Pre-war, we had totally free transit. Everything's normal. Then, in Stage 1, tanker traffic completely halts because maritime insurers just withdraw their coverage from the risk zone altogether. By Stage 2, Iran establishes transit tolls, basically attempting to dictate maritime norms, which forces nations like the UAE to literally hide their exports by turning off their ships' tracking systems. And as we push deep into Stage 3, that resulting massive supply constriction risks driving oil prices anywhere from $120 to a staggering $200 per barrel. This selective blockade forcefully reorients Asian allies, like Japan and India, who rely almost entirely on this flow of energy. It literally pulls them right out of Western alliances out of pure economic necessity. And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, Stage 4 and Geopolitical Transformation. Because at this point, this isn't just a continuation of the war, it is a permanent restructuring of global power. Look at the gravity of this shift on the chart. If you combine Iran's 20% of global oil flow with Russia's 11%, you are looking at an axis that functionally controls over 30% of the world's oil supply. In a prolonged, drawn-out conflict, these nations can tacitly coordinate to constrict this supply. That would essentially starve Western economies, driving up inflation and interest rates to crushing levels, all while a nation like China steps in to absorb that redirected energy at a massive discount. What we are witnessing right before our eyes is the death of the unipolar world. For decades, we operated under a system of uncontested U.S. dominance, totally free global trade, and centralized coalition power. But due to Western military overstretch, the rapid depletion of those defense stockpiles we talked about, and the fragmentation of regional allies who are suddenly looking elsewhere for security guarantees, a multipolar world is hardening. We now have the US, China, Russia, and an emerging Iran acting as a fourth, distinct center of world power, completely reshaping global alliances through the control of energy. Now, early on in this conflict, there was a lot of talk about diplomatic off-ramps, but the cold, hard reality on the ground is that those narrow paths are collapsing. Proposals like Iran's 10-point plan, which includes lifting sanctions and recognizing their right to uranium enrichment, are practically impossible for Western leaders to accept in today's intense political climate. The mechanics of this escalation trap have locked decision-makers into a vicious cycle. Backing down looks like political defeat, but moving forward guarantees an even deeper, more catastrophic crisis. I want you to carefully consider this assessment from the Lupo Toro Global Analyst team. They wrote, "The real threat is not simply escalation, it is escalation in service of objectives that the chosen military instrument is poorly suited to achieve." Let that sink in for a second. Air power alone, no matter how incredibly precise it is, simply cannot dismantle deeply entrenched, deeply buried systems. And it certainly cannot break the political will of a fully mobilized, nationalistic population. So, we are left standing at an incredibly dangerous crossroads. If coercive bombing campaigns have failed to achieve their strategic goals, and a massive ground invasion risks not only catastrophic human casualties, but a literal collapse of the global economic system, how exactly does the world survive Stage 4? It's a grave reality we simply can no longer ignore. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the systems around you, and I will see you next time.